Hi, and welcome to In Talks With. I'm Danielle Radoichin. My guest on this episode is Aindrea Emelife. Aindrea is a Nigerian-British curator and art historian specialising in modern and contemporary art, with a focus on questions around colonial and decolonial histories in Africa, transnationalism, and the politics of representation. Her writing includes the book A Brief History of Protest Art, and in 2021 she was appointed to the Mayor of London's Commission for Diversity in the Public Realm. She is currently curator of modern and contemporary art at the Museum of West African Art in Edo State, Nigeria. This summer, Aindrea has curated an exhibition at Somerset House in London called Black Venus, which brings together the work of 18 black women and non-binary artists to explore the othering, fetishization, and reclamation of narratives around black femininity. The exhibition examines the complex narratives of black womanhood through the influences of three perceived archetypes: the Hottentot Venus, the Sable Venus, and the Jezebel, and reframes stereotypical notions of black womanhood through work of contemporary artists including Sonia Boyce, Amber Pinkerton, and Lorna Simpson. I met with Aindrea at Somerset House on the opening of the show to hear her thoughts on all of this and more.
Hi.
How's it going?
Good. It's quite surreal. I curated the exhibition in New York and in San Francisco, but seeing it in London definitely means something else. It feels like a homecoming, and it is very, very different, actually. It's not a copy and paste of the other shows. There's a lot of new works. I'm really, really excited to be involved.
Yeah. We are in Somerset House in London. And I think it is a homecoming for you because I have met you once before, and I remember we spoke about how you went to the Courtauld Institute.
Yeah.
Because I also studied there. So is that weird coming back to the same building again?
It is, and it's also really lovely because there's so many just sort of full circle moments. Like I remember studying at the Courtauld and loving my course, but also just being really aware that there's loads of stories that weren't that relevant to me, and I couldn't find things that were about, my history or about my representation. And so a lot of my curiosity was sort of, birthed then, like as, having that toy between loving the art that I was being taught and being fascinated by it, but wanting to see something else. And I think, this exhibition is a testament to that. But also, it was this time of discovery. Like there's some of the works that are featured in this exhibition that informed some of my essays whilst I was at the Courtauld and some of my research as well. So the fact that they're involved in the exhibition is very sentimental as well, to see them, to see something that meant a lot to me back then just come back in real form and be part of the show. So yes, it's very exciting.
So we're here to talk about the opening of Black Venus, which is a show you've curated, and it's here at Somerset House and running until September, I believe, 24th of September, and it's opening tomorrow, so this month in July. So it's bringing together the work of 18 artists, black women, non-binary artists, and the theme is the exploration of narratives around black femininity. How are you feeling about it now, seeing it in situ?
I think what's interesting about the exhibition is that it really confronts some quite uncomfortable truths, and I think that that's definitely a part of it. It shows some quite emotional legacies of the historic exoticization and fetishization of black women bodies. But in some ways, even despite, confronting these truths, there's definitely a sense of like celebration and hope as well. And I think that comes from the fact that there's historical works and there's a lot of contemporary works made by black women and non-binary artists, but it shows that despite or maybe in spite of the limitations put onto black women throughout history, artists have sought to really boldly reclaim and to take up space and to really dive into these histories and show the world that there's so much more than we've been told. And I think that that's why that there is this sort of hopeful celebration sort of feeling, as well as, a confrontational sort of sense of, understanding just how limited the way that we've viewed black women has been.
Yeah, that's really interesting you say that about having that dual theme confronting the sort of the problematic aspect of it, but also having that positive approach as well. I really sensed that walking around the exhibition. Can you remember how it felt when you first thought of the idea of the concept for the show? Like, can you remember sort of tracking the journey that you've been on with it?
Yeah, I mean, it depends on how early I want to go. I mean, I think that in some ways the exhibition has always kind of been there. So I was told the story of Hottentot Venus by my mother when I was quite young. I think I was maybe 8 or 9. And I did that typical thing where I rolled my eyes and I was like, okay, my mum's trying to teach me a history lesson.
So what was the content? How did she tell you about it? Was it more than this is something you need to know about? Or was it something you'd seen?
It was more just because she knew I was fascinated about history, but I think she wanted to sort of steer me on to, thinking more about other histories. So, I mean, our curriculum system in the UK has been focused on quite narrow ideas of history, and definitely not traversing into the ideas of Black history so much. I'm sure it's changing now, but she was very passionate of me to understand more about how I've sort of come to be and the legacies that have come before me. And I don't know, I wouldn't say it was a cautionary tale, but I think it was more sort of an urging to really look into things a little further. And so whilst, I did that typical thing of dismissing everything that your parents say, it definitely stuck with me in some ways and really informed my curiosity as I started to really build my love of museums. Like, I would always run towards a Black figure if I saw one in the National Gallery or any of these sort of more sort of like traditional spaces. I was very curious about their representations. But when it comes to this actual exhibition, I think that a lot of it comes from when you're sort of thinking about what sort of impact I feel that was my duty as a curator or an art historian. The art historical training that I had was very broad and very in-depth, but I sort of figured that even though I sort of focused quite a lot on surrealism actually and medieval art in my art historical training, even though I loved that, I felt that my duty and I guess my purpose was to really uncover a lot of these stories, because I felt that within the museum systems, where we think about what exhibitions get made, it's often due to who is represented in those spaces as curators or as directors. And if I was aspiring to be a curator, it was my duty to ensure that the exhibitions we see reflect the wider sense of humanity and the broadest sense of these stories. And so I started to investigate stories that were more relevant or more closely related to my own experience. And I think that's why there's shows like Black Venus, which spoke a lot to me understanding my place in the world as a Black woman, but also my representation within art. And I think almost if you think about every other curatorial endeavor that I have and I'm starting to go on to, there will always be this sense of, I guess, personal relation, but duty to also represent, stories that I feel we haven't been looking at close enough. So Black Venus has a start with the Hottentot Venus story of the South African woman that was toured throughout Europe as an attraction.
What time frame is it?
The Hottentot Venus was the 18th century.
Yeah, so it's quite a striking thing that you're sort of confronted with in the first room of the exhibition.
And you really start to think about just when. I mean, I guess it's quite interesting because it shows in the first room you see an image of that's by Renee Cox, which is called Hottentot, and that's when she is looking at this historical figure and reclaiming it for herself. And
so it's a reimagining of the 18th century.
It's a reimagining of the whole story, but also probably taking reference to some of the etchings and different sort of historical imageries. But what she's...
That 1994, I think.
That work.
So that's a large black and white photograph that you see as you enter on the right. It's actually the first image that I looked at anyway.
Yeah, and with that image, it's exciting because she's got this really strong gaze, which is almost challenging you to think about how many gazes have been put upon Black women and what sorts of gazes. And obviously we can think about the gaze that's been put onto Hottentot Venus when she was being toured around, but then we also think about the contemporary gaze that she, Renee, would have received as well. And what's fascinating about that image is that she's got these sort of like appendages that are put on which represent large breasts and large buttocks. Exactly.
So she's nude, but she's, like you say, got these, she's emphasizing the breasts and buttocks.
Exactly, just like Hottentot Venus. But when I spoke to the artist, she said she found these these appendages in a joke shop, and it almost also shows just how these appendages, which are actually, they were brown coloured, there is a colour version, but how these appendages were and still are associated with humour, how black women bodies were humorous because you could just buy them, and I don't know what you would where would be suitable to wear them, but somebody was, because it was readily available in as recently as the 90s to put on a pair of plastic large brown breasts and plastic large brown buttocks. So there's that sort of double element as well, which I think is quite fascinating
to think about. And then as you turn the corner, you see the original 18th century engravings of the Hottentot Venus and how she was presented in, I assume it was the press or in the sort of media of the time.
There's little caricatures, and there's also, some of the early billings, like, come and see this, curious woman with the, hypersexual, with a body that is so different than the other. And I think that was really important to show. Not enough people, it's a known story, but not everybody knows that story. I think it's quite an important one to understand.
There are two other themes that you've worked this exhibition around. There's the Sable Venus and the Jezebel. Do you want to talk about those two a bit as well?
Yeah, definitely. So there's an etching by Thomas Stothard, and that looks at, it's called The Voyage of the Sable Venus. And I came across that and was really struck by that work because in some ways, when you first look at it, it looks quite like a very typical Venus painting that you would see in art history. It's very similar to The Birth of Venus by Botticelli, for example. But in the center is a black woman, and that this black woman would have been a slave woman as well. And so there's this sort of juxtaposition of like very obvious sort of art historical language, things that we recognize and see very much in our sort of sense as art lovers, but then disrupted by this other ideal of beauty. And I think it's interesting because at first glance, it might be seen as a sort of like celebration of black beauty. But when you understand that it was part of this sort of like colonial exercise, you also can understand other sort of narratives, whether it's sort of almost excusing or promoting the colonial endeavor, or whether it's also just considering the extreme otherness of that comes by replacing the sort of more typical Venus with this instance as well. And then the Jezebel, I think, is a really important image as well, because when black women are presented and have been presented, it's often been associated with hypersexuality, often been sort of shown in ways that sort of excuse sexual violence or excuse like a very limited ideas that black women are overly sexual or savage. And so the artists that really reclaim and refute that are, also dealing with contemporary evolutions of that idea, which are still very much around, but in different ways, whether it's looking at the representation of black women in music videos, or looking, I was reading an article about how young black girls are sort of adultified. The term is adultification, where they're seen as older or more readily sexual, even though their sort of same age mates would not be seen as so. So I'm really fascinated by how all these images.
Why is that?
I think it comes between a lot of different stereotypes that are afforded to black women. I mean, you can think about the medical system where, there was a lot of, and it kind of converged with the Hottentot tale as well, where there were some scientific studies that were trying to prove that black people, which I guess also applies to black women, couldn't feel pain as much. And so they would posit that black people have more resilience, and so they are more suited to be doing certain types of things, whether it's slavery or whatever. And these sort of stereotypes are convenient because it allows for certain propagandas to fit in more neatly. And so where black women are hypersexualized, then that will obviously then trickle on to how quickly younger black women are sexualized as well. And I think I definitely see that in, I guess, also my own upbringing. I was talking to one of the artists, Aina Jackson, who resonated with me on the way that as young girls we are taught to be even more covered up and even more sort of deported in a certain way. And she definitely agreed that was obviously that's a sensibility that is afforded to all girls, and I think that's a problem in itself. But there is a sense of wanting.
You experienced yourself?
Yeah, being told to make sure that you are as covered as completely possible, just in case, and that that is not. That's not to say that that's exclusive just to Black girls, because that's definitely something that I think all girls are subject to, unfortunately. But I do think that there is an extremity that comes when we consider the Black young girls or Black womenness as well.
What made you interested when you were growing up? What made you interested in art and the idea of studying art history?
So I loved art as a young girl. I actually was really obsessed with the International Portrait Gallery and then secondly the National Gallery. I think that was because I really saw art as a way to learn about other people's perspectives. I think that's what I found most interesting. I had no want at all to be an artist, and I'm not a very good one. But what I was fascinated in is delving into the stories and the ideas that these artists are trying to interrogate. So I guess at the heart of it, loving art comes from a real curiosity about the world and curiosity about how people see things. And I guess as an art historian and a curator, it's incredible that I get to really be involved with that on a day-to-day basis and really understand all the different perspectives that art can bring. Obviously now it's even better because we're allowed and we're encouraged to really look more broadly into these stories and who tells these stories. I think that the timing of this exhibition and also of my career is really, really encouraging, because people are wanting to listen and be more curious about the stories in the world in general. And, I don't know why that didn't seem interesting before, because I think obviously as humans, it's really exciting to learn about everything in the world, not just this very narrow, small sort of history that we've been delivered and said, told that that's it. But it's incredibly exciting to me to be able to understand and really move around the world and figure out what stories artists have been trying to say and what stories artists are trying to say now.
So how did you go about as a curator, how did you go about selecting the artists that are featured in the show? We've already mentioned Renee Cox, and there's some really amazing pieces by Sonia Boyce, Lorna Simpson, Amber Pinkerton. What were the parameters you put around it when it came to choosing who to feature?
So choosing who to feature at any show is always really difficult. I think that the show's sort of at the core, the theme of the exhibition could go on and on and on, because there's so many different artists that I feel are really looking at this sort of core theme and idea. And there's some that have been doing so for, enduringly throughout their careers. People like Carrie Mae Weems, for example, who has a show at the Barbican as well, who has pretty much focused a lot of her career on really uncovering the wideness and the breadth of Black women's stories. And I think that having Carrie as part of the exhibition was very sentimental and very important as somebody that has really been, forging that path throughout her career. I wanted to ensure that there were artists that I felt hadn't been sort of investigated or shown enough. So artists like Maxine Walker, for example, and Maud Salter, who's a late Ghanaian Scottish photographer. Those works come from our UK collections. But as with everything, there's the timing and bringing out these ideas. And I really wanted to hopefully, with introducing their work, catalyze further investigation into their practices and really, show that so many artists have been doing this work and investigating these themes enduringly throughout history, but we just haven't, as art historians or exhibition makers, haven't really given them their due accolades or due attention. I really wanted to ensure that the Black woman story wasn't sort of trapped by very limited ideas of what womanness is. So that's why I included non-binary perspectives and queer perspectives as well. Having Zanelli's work is really emotionally important to me as well, because their work, Miss Black Lesbian, is one of the first works that I started, that was sort of started my research when I was in the Courtauld. And so having it included in the exhibition is very meaningful, but also having that sort of disruption of very simplistic ideas of beauty very, very important as well. So Zanelli's work was very, very integral to the process. I think what I wanted to do was obviously show a breadth intergenerationally and cross-geographically, show like an enduring sort of presence of these ideas over time, but also inspire hope as well by putting some very, very new and younger artists like Amber Pinkerton, like Alberta Whittle, who are really looking at our contemporary world, whether it's within the realms of fashion or the realms of sort of digital media and digital sort of like ownership of self, and have that included in the exhibition too, so that it, you know, spoke as well to my sort of story as a young Black woman and really sort of allowed for the widest breadth of understanding.
That's really nice. So you first showed this exhibition last year at Photographica in New York. How did did you feature the same works in that one?
No, so that show was quite different. What I always wanted to do, and I know it actually makes a lot more work for oneself, but I think it's vastly interesting, is to develop a show and have it tour but change. So that show had some of the sort of same elements, a few of the same works, but definitely had a little bit more of an African-American focus, given the geographical context, but also because a lot of my research, when I did undergo, had quite an African-American focus. A lot of the writers were African-American writers and historians, and they were very much looking African-American artists and what sort of stories they had to say. But when I wanted to tour back to UK, obviously this, you know, the enduring sort of themes have similarities, but there are differences as well. So having artists that really confront the peculiarities and differences of Europe and of the UK was important, and that's why I changed that. But it also allowed me to put in some other works that I was really, really excited to add. There's an incredible film work by Lorna Simpson that I'm really, really excited by, and a really great work from the Tate, which I think really sums up a lot of the ideas. It's got all these different pictures of Black men, and then in the middle there's this really beautiful image of a Black woman, and Lorna found this in a job lot that was called just like, I think, random, not called, like a series of Black boys or Black men, and amongst it there's this woman, and I think it was really symbolic because I think when Blackness is articulated, it often defaults to Black men, and I think that having this like sort of Black woman story poke out from this like cloud of Black maleness is quite symbolic and meaningful, and one of the more subtle, quieter moments in the exhibition, but something that I think is really, really exciting. So it's a bit different, and yeah, in some ways it's my favorite.
And I think is that the only male presence in the whole exhibition? Well?
Yeah.
It's quite, so you notice it.
Yeah, you do, and you're like, wait, this is why is this? It makes you want to look for. I guess what's also great about touring an exhibition and having it change over time is that it allows me to reflect and put in some of my newer ideas and newer perspectives into the exhibition. I think that in reality, my associations with this topic will always change as I get older, as I travel more, as I understand more about art and about myself. At the moment, I'm a woman in my 20s. I'm sure that my understanding of what it means to be a Black woman will change as I grow older, as maybe I become a mother, as everything else happens. And I think that, yeah, even in the short time that this is toured, the breadth of, you know, things that I've learned about myself and about Black women throughout history has definitely impacted in the way that this show is presented as well.
Yeah,
so
I think that was kind of what I was trying to get at when I asked you earlier about what you, like, you know, that thing when you try and remember what your vision was at the beginning, it's almost like you can't remember.
Yeah.
Because it's changed so much. What would you say has changed about you?
I think what's changed about me is understanding that and I think it's not just in the process of this exhibition, just maybe throughout my sort of life as a art historian and as a Black woman in the world, but understanding that there's so much history that's related to Black womanness, and that really gives you a sense of hope and comfort, but also it energizes me, I think, to understand that there's so many, you know, writers and historians that have been thinking on this and that have almost sort of, you know, thinking about how it's bubbled up to maybe this moment and hopefully other moments. What I definitely think it's allowed me to feel is that there is a much richer community than I think I actually ever realized. And I think speaking to some people that just saw the exhibition, they also feel that as well. I think that sometimes it can feel quite isolating to be a Black woman in certain rooms, in certain fields. You know, I didn't mention, but I got bursaries to certain private schools, and I was very much always the only Black girl in these rooms, in these ideas. So it's very easy to think that this sort of history and this community doesn't exist. And then you walk into a room or some of the rooms in the exhibition, and you're just confronted by this like enduring legacy of Black women who have come before and fought before, or just lived everyday lives before. And it's comforting and it's uplifting, but it also gives you like a sort of fire in your belly to just keep going. So I think that sort of sense of community has definitely been part of this process, and also a sense of learning. So obviously I've learned about myself, but also just learned more and more about these ideas, because, you know, undergoing the exhibition, I did my own research, but also was, you know, afforded the opportunity to speak to some of the sort of curators and historians that I looked up to when I was studying, people like Thelma Golden, people like Professor Denise Morel, who did the incredible show Modèle Noir at the d'Orsay, where she renamed or found the names of some of the Black sitters. People like Professor Deborah Willis, who wrote The Black Female Body, which is a book which is very hard to get and definitely should be reprinted, but really has a lot of great research of much earlier instances of photography. And really, speaking to these women as well was very encouraging, and gives you that sort of sense of like, okay, we must forge on and inspire the future as well. So it's been a great experience with that.
And you've written an accompanying book.
Yes, so the book comes out next year, and that is very much furthering on of all of these researches and these ideas. So there's lots of essays, there's a few interviews with some of these people I just mentioned, a real deep dive with some of the artists, and everything that one can't present in an exhibition for logistics and space. I really went with and ran with the book. So when that comes out, that'll be another great moment as well, because again, it's trying to make the book that I wish I had when I was younger. It's an academic book, but it's also very approachable and really traverses all the different elements, whether it's high art or social media or visual culture, and allows us to understand the real enduring legacy of Black women throughout all of those spheres.
And when's that coming out?
That is slated for autumn next year. So
exciting. And that's also called Black Venus.
Black Venus, yeah.
Reclaiming the...
I think it's just Black Venus. I don't think I've got a subtitle.
That one. So it's called Black Venus as well.
Yeah.
And the exhibition here is running until 24th of September. And I saw that it's a pay what you can admission fee. What kind of audience are you thinking about, or were you thinking about when you were putting the exhibition together?
So I was thinking of the broadest audience possible, which is why I was so pleased that Somerset House could make pay as you can available and possible. I think that when curating an exhibition that is about a really broad demographic, or a demographic that has not been represented, it's important that they themselves can see the exhibition. As I definitely think is close to my heart, is I want to make this exhibition for everybody, but I also want to ensure that Black women and Black queer voices can see this exhibition as well, given that it holds a lot of sentiments that have the possibility to uplift and inspire. In general, the projects I like to curate, I always think in my head, how can I make art more relevant to more people more often? I think that the success of a show is not the 0.5% of my art historical peers that will just come and nod their head and say, well done. That's always really lovely and exciting. And but I don't curate or write for that small demographic. I think art has real power to change how we see ourselves and see the world. And I think the success is having very interesting, and having these academic ideas presented in a way that is still digestible and still approachable. So there's like that sort of go-between of, introducing in some ways some complicated ideas and theories, but ensuring that most people can understand and get that benefit, because that's what really inspired me to get into art, because I learned so much about myself and about the world, and I continue to do so. And artists have a really, really brilliant way of teaching you these lessons in a very, very engaging way that's just different to reading or listening to a documentary. It's much more subtle or much more confrontational in some instances, but very, very, very powerful. So I hope that with Pay As You Can and some of the other initiatives that we're doing at Summit the House, the largest demographic can feel at home in the exhibition, as I do, and as I am hearing other people are starting to as well.
So great. Well, listen, I love the exhibition, and I'm sure that lots of people are going to come and see it. And thank you so much for talking to me, Aindrea. Best of luck with it.
Thanks so much.
You've been listening to In Talks with me, Danielle Radoichin. The sound and theme music is by Woogie Productions, and the artwork is by Patrick Waugh. If you enjoyed this episode, please pass it on to someone who you think might also like it. Please subscribe and leave a review. To pitch for guest ideas, you can DM me via my socials at Danielle Radoichin. Thanks for listening.